Good morning, everyone. We are going to get started with our webinar for today. Thank you for joining us. My name is Helen Schroeder. I'm the marketing coordinator here at Sigma Assessment Systems, and I will be co-piloting your webinar while my colleague Leonid Beletsky is presenting. For those of you who are new to Sigma, I just want to give you a brief introduction to who we are and what we do. We're a professional services firm that offers talent development, succession planning, and psychological assessments for organizations that are looking to build their internal talent pools, like you all. Sigma has been in business for over 50 years, so as a company, we have a lot of experience, and we're happy to be sharing some of that with you today as we talk about how to identify critical roles. A little bit of housekeeping up front. Today, we have about 60 minutes together. For the first 45 minutes or so, Leonid will walk you through the webinar content to introduce you to critical roles in succession planning as a context, but you can use it for general talent development, and to discuss what they are, how you identify them, and we'll share some practical tips and tools that you can use for your organization as well. We will be recording this session and we'll share a recording afterwards, so no need to take frantic notes. You will receive that recording later today or tomorrow once it's available, and we'll also send you a copy of the webinar slides. At the end, we'll reserve 15 minutes for a question and answer period. That's what the Q&A box is for. So if you have any questions that come up as we're going through the webinar, please don't hesitate to drop those questions there. I will moderate them. And anything that we don't get time to go through together today, we would be happy to follow up with you via email. But for now, use the Q&A. That's what it's there for. We would love to answer as many questions as we can. And now, without further ado, let me introduce you to our presenter today. Leonid is pursuing his PhD in industrial organizational psychology at Western University. His research is primarily focused on investigating factors that contribute to optimal work motivation, well-being, and performance. He also maintains interests in psychometric assessments and personality. And at Sigma, Leo applies his expertise to supporting the consulting team with succession planning, as well as talent and leadership development. And if I may say, he's also become our expert in AI. So if you happen to have questions about what's happening on that front and how it relates to talent development, he might be available to answer some questions to that at the end of the session as well. And now I'll pass it off to you, Leo, to get us started.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Helen, for the lovely introduction. Hi, folks. Hope everyone's having a lovely day so far. And yeah, let's get started talking about critical role identification. I'll start off with the general outline of the things we're going to talk about today. So, of course, we're going to start with the basics, and basics not meaning, rudimentary or simple, just kind of defining what we actually mean by critical roles and setting those operational definitions for our discussion today. Talking about how they fit into the larger succession planning process, why it's worth taking the time to actually identify them. And then we'll move into process. So I'll walk you through a framework that we use for actually identifying which roles are critical in your organization. It's quite practical, it's straightforward, and generally something that you can start using quite quickly. And then the final section here is we're going to wrap up with some general tips. So common mistakes that we see and how you might be able to avoid them, how to think about the very important notion of critical positions versus critical people. And then I'll point you to some of our tools, templates that you can take, that you can use to take the next step if this is something that you actually want to bring back to your team. And you don't need to memorize any of this. Obviously, like Helen said, no need to frantically jot down notes. The goal is just to give you clarity and a starting point to think about your own organizations. So yeah, let's jump in right off the bat before we go any further. Very quick pulse check from the group. Does your organization currently have a succession plan? So this can be formal, this can be kind of informal. Maybe you've got a documented strategy with identified successors. Maybe it's more of a, we know who would probably step in kind of situation. Either way, it's totally fine. So you should be able to see it pop up in your Teams client to respond to the poll. And I'll give everyone a few moments to fill that out. And for all these polls, I should say there is absolutely no correct or incorrect answer whatsoever. Okay. So it looks like so far the predominant theme is there is succession planning going on, which is good, but it might be isolated to kind of local organizational units or teams. So it's not a universal standard process. But really, that's already a very, very strong first step. And now we're seeing quite a few people also with already pre-existing formal succession planning processes. Okay. All right, so we have a pretty most people have selected one of the top three options, and that's pretty typical. So regardless of which spot you reside in within this poll, hopefully you'll be able to get something useful out of today's discussion. Give you a couple more seconds here. All right, we'll close that one out. That sets a good foundation for our discussion today. So let's start by, like I said, talking about some operational definitions, grounding ourselves in a clear definition for succession planning for today's discussion. Broadly speaking, it's the process of identifying and developing internal talent to fill critical roles when vacancies occur for various reasons, right? So turnover is inevitable at organizations. It's going to happen. People retire. They might leave for other opportunities. Stuff changes, life happens. And so, like I said, turnover is going to happen regardless. But succession planning helps ensure that when that happens, there is a very clear plan in place. So you're not scrambling to fill a gap. Where did I hear? Yes, maybe that was someone joining the meeting. Um, you're not scrambling to fill a gap. You've already thought about who might be ready, and then you've also thought about how to get that person ready. It's a much more proactive approach compared to what's called replacement hiring. So you have replacement hiring, which is very reactive. You're reacting to the circumstances on the ground. And then you have succession planning, which is a proactive approach. Um, and so reactive typically looks like, okay, posting a job and hoping you find the right person. And oftentimes that happens under time pressure. So those things often don't mix very well. And then succession planning shifts the focus from, like I said, reacting to planning ahead. It also gives you time to develop people internally very intentionally and make sure the right person is prepared to step in when the time actually comes. So now that we've talked about what succession planning is definitionally, let's look at why it's worth doing it in a structured way. So at Sigma, we do take a structured approach to succession planning. We've also seen the difference that it makes with clients. So first of all, in terms of supporting and motivating employees. When organizations do succession planning well, people see that there is a path forward, right? So that can be extremely motivating for employees to see that there are development plans in place for them, and they kind of are able to see the future for themselves within that organization. It also helps create a broader culture of growth and development. So this is not restricted just to what we would call high potential employees, but more so across the board. Um, the other important point is just retaining that institutional or often called organizational knowledge. So especially this is especially important in roles that carry a lot of this institutional memory or proprietary processes that the people have learned over the course of their tenure at the organization. In terms of general confidence of stakeholders, et cetera, people aren't left guessing about what happens if someone important leaves. You can assure people that we have a plan for all of these different contingencies. And from a communicational standpoint, it makes the entire process much more transparent and less political because people understand how the succession planning process actually works, what the criteria are, what the development opportunities are, and all those associated variables. So these outcomes are they're difficult to achieve if you're doing succession planning informally or if it's inconsistent. So that's why structure matters, not kind of just checking a box, but actually making the process work for your organization. So this is broadly at a high level, the model that we use at Sigma. It's a six-step process to build what we would call a strong succession plan. And you can think of it as a pipeline. It starts with identifying what roles matter most, and it ends with tracking how well your plan is actually working over time. Although with clients, we'll frequently, bounce between these different stages to make adjustments as needed. So it is a linear process, but there's room for customization as well. So Let me briefly walk you through these stages to give you the full picture, and then we'll spend the rest of the time kind of zoomed in onto that first highlighted step. So first order of business, we identify critical roles. And then, like I said, that's our focus for today. So before you can actually plan for succession, you need to know what roles are worth planning for. And we'll go into detail on how to do this in a moment. Once those roles are identified, we build success profiles. So defining what success actually looks like in each of these roles, right? What kind of competencies, what sort of skills, what sort of relevant knowledge a person needs, and what kind of qualities does a person need to succeed in that role. Next, we nominate successors. So we identify potential internal candidates who might be a good fit for those roles identified on those success profiles in the future. And from there, we assess development needs. Um, so where are the gaps between, okay, so where you have candidates right now, what are the gaps between where this candidate is currently and where they need to be to successfully step into the role? And then step 5 is actually the talent development process. So putting support opportunities in place to get the people ready. And finally, we establish a progress measuring system for the succession plan. So, checking in regularly to see how things are going, where we need to make adjustments and tweaks along the way. So this is quite quick and brief, but I do want you to have a very um, an understanding of how this process typically works at our organization. But like I said, today we're focusing pretty much entirely on that first step, and it's very important because it's very foundational to the process. Um, if you get this part right, the rest becomes substantially easier to do correctly. So again, talking about how to identify critical roles, let's take a second to actually think about what a critical role is. So there are roles, typically these are roles that have the greatest impact on your organization's success. And this impact can take a lot of different forms. So typically people might kind of gravitate in their heads towards, executive and senior leadership roles. Sure, those can absolutely be critical, but you might also find essential roles at a deeper level within the organization. And we'll talk about an example in a moment. Um, so in the form of a case study, but as things like specialized technical experts, someone who owns a very core client relationship within the company might be lower on the org chart, but still very vital. So I guess what I would say is don't assume that the title or seniority level alone is what defines the criticality of a role. And most importantly, when you start succession planning, it's not about planning for, okay, we need to plan for every single role, right? It's about being very strategic and focusing your efforts on, okay, where would turnover affect us the absolute most, and starting with a few of those roles. So as an example of why focusing on executives and senior leadership isn't always the way to go, picture a mid-sized healthcare organization that's just starting to think about succession planning. It's on their radar, might not have a formal process in place. If you ask them what their critical roles were, it's very likely they'd probably point to senior leadership, right? The CFO, so the C-suite, maybe department heads, maybe a few clinical leads. But when they actually go through the process of evaluating roles across the organization, they find that one job very unexpectedly rises to the top, and this is the scheduling coordinator. And this is not a high level position on the chart, but it turns out that this person manages, all the staffing schedules for frontline workers. They're the go-to connection node between multiple departments. And over time, they've built up a lot of their own informal systems and acquired that institutional knowledge that no one else really understands. So imagine that this person suddenly goes on leave, and that's where things can start falling apart. You know, shifts are missed, communicational facets break down, and ultimately, in this particular case, patient care delivery is what suffers. So this very brief hypothetical highlights what can be a common reality. Sometimes the roles that carry the most risk aren't the ones with the most impressive or senior titles. They're the ones that, might quietly be keeping things running, and they can easily get overlooked if we're not being very structured about critical role identification. So Why go through the effort of identifying critical roles in the first place? Yes, it helps leaders prioritize their succession planning, but there's a lot more value here than just making, a list of important jobs. When you take the time to do this well, right, kind of front loading that work, you start to recognize roles that do have a strong impact, not on paper, but in terms of how the organization is functioning on a daily basis. You start thinking about roles that have unique skills or unique knowledge, and especially those that are, like I said, tied to the unique organizational knowledge structure. Um, Kind of maybe you use certain legacy software systems. We do see that sometimes, or they have extremely niche expertise. You also identify roles that might become vacant soon for a whole bunch of different reasons. Maybe someone just kind of forgot to let someone know. And so you're not caught off guard by unexpected turnover. You're also examining the internal and external availability of talent. It helps you spot where there are gaps in those domains, or maybe where it makes more sense to build talent from within. And from a kind of broader talent strategy, it allows you a very good opportunity to invest in employee growth and development much more intentionally and explicitly, which has lots of associated benefits. You're more likely to confidently and competently fill vacancies with the best talent as opposed to the best person we could find. And like I said, retaining organizational knowledge and generally making the company much more resilient. So now that we've talked about why identifying critical roles matters, we can take a look at much more closely at how to do it. So this is when we start translating the kind of more theoretical stuff into something more actionable. So because there's no one size fits all answer, you can kind of start picturing what this might look like in the context of your own unique organization. So before that, I have a question for you all. Does your company already have a clear understanding of which roles are critical? Like I said before, there's no correct or incorrect answer to this question. Might be thinking, yeah, we have a pretty good idea, maybe for some organizational units, but not so much. The organizations vary in the degree of structure that they have in place. So, all right. So far, this is pretty much what we see, what I would expect. So the which is already good. You have a general idea of what roles are most critical, but maybe there isn't a very structured and documented process or fine-grained analysis of each one of those roles. The other thing sometimes is organizational units might within them understand what people are critical, but this isn't kind of aggregated at a higher level, which makes implementing a more universal succession planning effort more challenging. Okay, looks like option number two kind of remains the most popular. That's good in the sense that it also sets us up nicely for the next part of the discussion. All right, I think we've gotten responses from most people. Thank you very much. Okay. So like I said, moving into the practical parts, how do you actually go about identifying which roles are critical in your organization? At Sigma, we use something called the Critical Role Identification Questionnaire. So this is a structured tool that helps you evaluate roles objectively, okay, not just based on feelings or intuition, but or maybe who's currently in them, right? Because that can really sway how people feel about a particular role. And this questionnaire looks at 5 key criteria, which give you a well-rounded view of each role's strategic importance. And they also help you compare roles across departments in a consistent way, right? Because you're using a more consistent scoring strategy. So first we look at urgency of need, right? How soon might this role become vacant? Then we look at what would happen if the role was left unfilled. Also, does the role require deep expertise, unique knowledge, and those things that we've already touched on? Do we have anyone in-house who could step into this role, right? The degree to which that is true. And if not, how difficult would it be to hire for this role externally? And so together, these criteria give you a much clearer picture of the risk and readiness. And so altogether, they help you better prioritize which roles actually need a succession plan first and which you should prioritize. So this is a quick overview of the tool we use to evaluate which roles are critical. You kind of go role by role, one role at a time. Okay, so the role goes on the far left. Each of the criteria we discussed is scored on a 5-point scale. So for example, if the role is very likely to become vacant soon, you'd give it a 5 for urgency, right? And if it would be easy to fill from outside the organization, you'd give it a lower score for external talent, because that reflects those two kind of internal and the urgency domain and the external talent availability. And then once you've scored all 5 columns, you simply total up the row. Roles that generally have higher scores are more likely to be critical, and they're the ones you might want to focus on first. So next, I'll kind of walk you through what each of these 5 criteria means in more detail, and then you can actually apply it to the questionnaire. So like I said, first, urgency. This one is very straightforward, but still critical. How likely is it that this role is going to become vacant in the very near future, right? Retirement, promotion, turnover, burnout risk, anything else that might cause someone to leave their role. And what you're doing here is estimating how soon you'll think you'll need to fill it. If the current role holder is likely to stay for more than 5 years, that's maybe lower urgency. If they're likely to leave within 3 years or less, that might be urgent. You might kind of bump up the score a little bit. And if you're unsure, you might make best estimates based on the information you have available. So even flagging roles where there might be some uncertainty can be a good impetus for follow-up conversations with important people. So next criterion is impact. So this one's about understanding how much a vacancy in this role would, on the whole, affect your organization. So when you're scoring, the question to keep in mind is if this role were empty tomorrow, what would the consequences be? Would operations stall? Would we not be able to make key decisions? Would customers feel it? And sometimes impact is obvious, like senior leadership roles, but in other cases, it can be more subtle or it might take more time to manifest itself. So it could be someone who manages the workflow behind the scenes, right? Kind of like the coordinator role we talked about earlier, that has a lot of functionality that other people don't really understand. So it's worth taking the time to think this through very carefully, especially for roles like we touched on earlier, lower in the org chart that might be quietly holding things together, but aren't always very visible. And a good point to remember here is you're not trying to rank people, right? It's the role itself, it's the function, the reach of the role, and the potential fallout if the role is unfilled. So you're not focusing on the individual within that role. Okay, we're talking about the position itself. It's hard to abstract yourself from the individual filling the role, but that's kind of what we have to do to take a more structured approach. So now next we look at skills. How much specialized ability is required to perform the role successfully? So how technically demanding is this job? Are there certifications, hands-on expertise, formal education that might be required for someone stepping into this role? Right. So these might include things that are commonly called, hard skills, financial modeling, programming, operation of specialized equipment, or maybe some of the softer skills, like I said, navigating internal systems, or maybe being able to maintain longstanding client relationships. So the more complex or specialized the role is, the higher it should score. And this step isn't just about evaluating the role, it's going to help you later when you start identifying succession candidates, right? If the skills bar is high, you want to know that now so you can start thinking about development well in advance. Now, the fourth criterion is internal talent, and this one's all about general readiness. How easy or difficult would it be to fill this role with someone who's already within your organization? So think about your internal pipeline. If you've got several strong candidates who could step into the role maybe within the next few years, you might give it a lower score. If there are few or no candidates, then they would need obviously more than X number of years for development to be ready. That would be a higher score. And so these things can, of course, vary from organization to organization, but it's important to think very critically when scoring this. Um, and this step helps you identify where you already have bench strength, right? And then where you might not, where you might need to start building it. And it's not about putting pressure on specific individuals. It's a way to look at organizational readiness and risk so you know where to start focusing your development efforts, because that takes a lot of effort and time. And then the last criterion is external talent availability. How difficult would it be to fill this role from outside the organization? This includes things like how competitive the labor market is right now, whether the role requires a niche skill set, is there a steep onboarding curve for a potential person joining the company? So you're not just thinking about finding someone, right? You might find someone, but how long is it going to take you to get that person up to speed and functional within the organization? So if it's a role where talent is readily available, and you'd expect a new hire to ramp up quickly, you might score this lower. But if the role is hard to recruit for, external hires would need a lot of training or adjustment time, then that's a higher score. So this one often pairs with the internal talent score, right? If both are high, it's a good sign you need to start thinking about the internal development very soon as opposed to later. So once you've gone through the 5 criteria and scored your roles, the next step is pretty simple. You look at the total score, like I said, and identify those with the higher scores. So this could be because the role is likely to be vacated soon, a vacancy would impact the business, it requires specialized skills, the interplay between internal and external talent. And we would, based on what you see on that questionnaire, we recommend maybe like placing a marker or a star beside the very high scoring roles to flag them as critical, at least for the time being. All right, so let's talk about some kind of practical tips and maybe some common mistakes that we see with critical role identification. So there's some pretty easy kind of traps to fall into. Even teams with the best intentions, they can overlook certain factors, maybe default to certain assumptions. So let's walk through kind of 5 common mistakes that we might see. So first, we've already touched on this, but it's very important. Assuming only executive positions or senior positions are critical. It's just very common. Um, they kind of get more of the spotlight, but it's absolutely worthwhile to dig much more deeply and think about how your organization functions. The second one, not really realizing the degree of technical skill or institutional knowledge required for some roles, especially if this is kind of a role where someone is filling it and they're kind of doing their work quietly behind the scenes. Nobody really talks to them, but then you realize, oh my gosh, there's so much stuff required to actually do this properly. We might underestimate the nuance or the implicit knowledge that someone brings to a role until that person is gone. So if it's hard to document or kind of train, it's probably more critical than it looks on paper. And then we've sort of touched on this at the beginning, only responding to urgent changes instead of planning proactively. I understand the tendency to do this because succession planning is a lot of upfront work, right? So we tend to focus on roles when there's already movement happening. Someone's retiring, someone's leaving, someone's being promoted. But if we only react to vacancies, we also completely miss the opportunity to prepare well in advance, right? Fourth, underestimating how difficult it will be to fill a role, whether that be internally or externally, right? It might be, an assumption, oh, we'll just post the job, right? But if internal bench strength is low and the external market is tight, this can turn into a very, very lengthy and actually very expensive process. I'm sure lots of you are familiar, if not all of you, with how costly hiring someone is. So I think that difficulty should definitely factor into your criticality score. And this is something I really, really want to highlight is trying to find an exact replica of the incumbent in the position. And this one is very tricky because when someone's been in a role for a very long time, it's natural to want to look for someone, just like them. Unfortunately, that can really limit your options, right? So instead of trying to replicate that person, just try to abstract from that and focus on the role itself and what success in that position really requires both right now and also in the future, if there are any factors that are going to maybe change the various factors that I kind of define success. So let's, I've talked for a little bit. Let's turn this back to you again for a moment. Based on what we just covered, right? What potential mistakes do you think your organization might run into when if you're going through the process of identifying critical roles? So this isn't about getting it right or wrong. It's about noticing where your team might have to strategically slow down, ask some more questions, maybe think about any assumptions that might not be particularly valid, right? So go ahead and respond to this one once the poll shows up in Teams. I got assuming only executive positions are critical. We talked about that. Not realizing degree of skill. Yep. Not responding to urgent needs. Underestimating how difficult it will be to fill a role. And then we just talked about trying to find an exact replica of the incumbent. Yeah, and like I said, responding to urgent needs. It's very easy, let's say, for me to say, oh, plan in advance, this and that, but there's so much going on. Lots of facets of organizational functioning are incredibly fast paced. There's lots of things to kind of keep in mind. So it is very challenging. Uh, we got a much more even distribution for this one. In fact, it's almost perfect. But okay. So no particular standout option here. It seems like there's quite a bit of variance across all people. Really appreciate your responses there. All right. So really want to drive this point home. Something to watch for, and this comes up a lot. Critical people and critical positions. Sometimes a role seems critical, right? But again, it's the person in it who's bringing a ton of value. They might have taken on extra responsibilities, right? Or what we might call organizational citizenship behaviors, built very deep relationships with other people at the company, might be managing particularly valuable clients, things we've already touched on, and which is great, right? But from a succession planning standpoint, it can be very tricky because we don't want to create cookie cutter successors who are expected to replace this exact person exactly as they are. So we want to prepare candidates to fill the position itself, even if that means maybe tweaking redefining or redistributing some responsibilities. You need to think about how the role is going to evolve in the future, considering that the person in it right now won't be there. Uh, so in cases where someone wears multiple hats, right, it might make sense to break their role into, some number of functional components, or perhaps multiple roles. And this gives you something much clearer to plan around. And then it reduces the risk of trying to replace, kind of a unicorn with the assumption you're going to find another one. All right, before we start wrapping up here, I just want to reinforce this. Identifying critical roles is very important. Hopefully that I've made that pretty clear, but it is just the first step. Okay, so succession planning is a full process. It takes a lot of time. Once you've identified which roles to focus on, there's still quite a bit of work to do, although you've laid a very strong foundation, right? So in step two, you define what success looks like in each role, not for particular people. And that's where success profiles come in. And then step three, we actually nominate potential successors. So really thinking about the people you see as strong candidates for each role, if they exist internally. And then step four, understanding what those candidates need to develop in order to be ready. So where are those gaps in qualifications and skills? Maybe there's kind of formal certifications people need before they step into a role. Is that person even interested in stepping into that role, right? There's lots to think about. Um, And then step 5 is where development actually happens through targeted plans for specific roles and specific people, and development experiences that are engaging and making time for those development experiences, and valuing that process kind of on a cultural basis within the company. And then finally, step 6 is about maintaining that progress measurement over time. Are we doing things that are resulting in tangible benefit? And this is this whole measurement strategy is where, based on our kind of the data that we have, we can go back and make tweaks as needed. So, like I said, this slide, makes the process look linear, but there is some circularity and kind of customization and adjustment that's built into it. And then I just kind of want to remind you that Sigma has templates and tools for every stage. So when the slides go out, or at some point, you should be able to just access those. Um, this slide gives you kind of a quick look at those resources if you're using kind of, let's say, your full succession planning toolkit or what have you. So even though today we focused on the very beginning of the process, the ultimate goal is a smooth and confident transition, right? When the time comes for whatever roles you might be thinking about. All right, a couple more polls coming at you folks. So to wrap up, I want to zoom out a bit and ask a more strategic question. How successful is your team at implementing strategic plans, right? Succession planning, especially critical role identification, only really makes a difference when it's tied to execution, um, right? So not just having names on paper, following through, building development plans, measuring progress, and all that stuff. So I'll give you a moment to fill this one out. So either we always follow through, we sometimes follow through, sometimes we create strategic plans and they might be great, but maybe don't have the time or didn't make the time to follow through, and maybe didn't create strategic plans at all. Oh, this is already quite optimistic. Sometimes following through, that's pretty good. I mean, really, it is challenging to always follow through on everything. There's so many variables that can, you might have had some very impressive organizational effort underway, but something kind of unexpected came up and you can't be completely consistent each and every time. All right. Sometimes follow through. Okay, that one seems to be like the most popular option, and that is also quite reflective of what we usually see. All right. In case you aren't tired of polls, I have one more for you. This one kind of as a follow-up to the last question, digging a little bit deeper, even with the best plans in place, implementation can be tough, right? So there are often real world challenges, and this isn't a comprehensive list of all the possible challenges, but thinking about which of these is probably the greatest challenge of the options when you're trying to implement strategic plans within your organization. So what are the biggest barriers between strategy and execution? Actually, talking about challenges and putting a name to them is a very important first step. Once you can identify something and name it, you can do something about it. But if you don't have that, then it's kind of challenging, right? Mhm. Time, yeah, kind of hinted at that earlier. Long-term commitment is an interesting one because it's important to design, let's say employee development, right? It's a very long-term process, and there are specific things that you kind of need to sprinkle in along the way to make the process engaging for the people that are actually working towards a different role and working on their skills. So kind of making dedicated time to do that, valuing that, um, having intermediate milestones to kind of keep people motivated. And also, this is where measuring progress. Well, measuring progress can address kind of the buy-in component as well. Um, but measuring progress and seeing that what you're doing makes a difference can be very motivating, right? So if you have a regular frequent strategy to look at what your metrics, where your metrics are at, it makes long-term adherence to a plan much easier. All right. Thanks, everyone. I appreciate your participation. So now just kind of to wrap up, a few points, kind of if your team is just starting out maybe, or if you've hit roadblocks trying to move succession planning forward, maybe related to those variables we just identified, working with a consultant, it can help build momentum and get things started. So it's not just having extra hands and an extra person who can do stuff. It's about structured support. So the time savings by streamlining processes and handling a lot of the admin work, a clear process that's already been tested with other teams facing very similar or this exact same challenges, having the accountability so your plan doesn't just sit on a shelf. Someone helps keep things rolling. Also objectivity, right? So someone who can impartially come in, and this is especially important when identifying talent or making very tough calls, right? And then of course, kind of with expertise, having seen what works and what doesn't work across a wide variety of organizations is certainly helpful. So if this all feels like a lot, it is, and that's totally normal and fine. The take home point here is that you don't necessarily have to figure it out on your own. That's kind of the takeaway message here. And so before we wrap up, I also want to share a simple next step that can give you a helpful starting point if you're not sure where to begin. So we have a quick succession planning diagnostic. It's like a short 5-minute survey. When you complete it, you'll get customized tips, resources, and then if you'd like, one of our consultants can follow up with a free consultation to walk through your results. So unlike a lot of automated reports, these are actually reviewed by people. So that's pretty good for getting suggestions that are tailored to your situation. Yeah. All right. Let's see. Don't think I missed anything there. And I think we can, I think at this point, let's see. We're pretty much right on time. So I think we've got about 15 minutes for Q&A. If anybody has any questions, whether directly tied to the stuff we talked about today or any other topics, I'm happy to chat.
All right, thank you, Leo. So like Leo said, please do post those Q&A questions in the Q&A. I think something might have just come in the chat. Oh, thank you very much, Michael, for that feedback.
Thank you, appreciate it.
While we wait for some questions to trickle in, I'll just start with some of the common questions that we've received in the past, and that might spur some of your imaginations. So one of the first questions is, what if all the roles in my organization are critical? How would you approach a situation like that?
Yeah, we've gotten kind of variants of that question before, and I think it's very common to feel that way. And this is especially the case in what one might call lean organizations. But the key is to differentiate between roles that are valuable, okay, and then those that are truly critical in the short term to business continuity, strategic goals, customer service, risk mitigation, whatever, compliance, who knows. So using the 5 criteria, so I would encourage you to use the 5 criteria, use the scoring procedure, urgency, impact, skills, internal and external talent to introduce some objectivity into the process, right? So just sometimes it just takes some dedicated time to sit down and really think about it. And it's very difficult. I'm not saying that this is easy peasy, but that's kind of that's the answer that I would give to that one.
That's great. Thank you. Okay, we've got some questions trickling in here. So let's start with, what has been in best governance structure to revisit your succession plan? How does this tie in with developing internal mobility for employees?
Mhm. That's a tough question just because I don't know if I can very adequately speak to the governance component. But what I would say is that it's important to have general buy-in to the process at various levels. So, making it clear to whatever stakeholder one might be talking about, that, this is a lot of work. This is a lot of kind of time put into it. But in the long run, this is going to make us much more resilient, competitive, and it's probably going to save us, a great deal of finances. And I think best governance to revisit your succession plan. In terms of revisiting too, is the metrics that you identify for measuring progress. Those, you might want to get feedback on those from a wide variety of people, depending on who you're referring to, and making sure that those metrics are kind of aligned with the strategic direction of the organization. And that can help figure out, okay, how do we need to make adjustments to improve internal employee mobility, improve our development plans and things of the sort. So yeah, sorry about not tying in the governance part as explicitly as I would like to, but that's kind of what I would say. I think we've got some more questions coming in.
We do, yeah. One thing I'll just mention on this one before we move on is that in terms of revisiting plans, what we usually do with clients is we recommend revisiting a plan every 6 months, or if there's been a significant change either in organizational structure or strategic directions, that would give you impetus to say, let's sit down and look at if our critical roles have changed or our goals. And in terms of governance structure, Sigma usually sets up what we call a succession advisory team, or SAT, and that's basically just an internal team that is dedicated to championing your succession planning process. And we have a blog on how to create a succession advisory team. If I have a moment, I'll drop a link in the chat for you there. So hopefully those help. And if not, please do send us an email. Our email information is up there on the screen, and we can talk a little bit more about the specific situation your organization is in offline.
Mhm.
All right, next question. How would you recommend incorporating these concepts into performance reviews and/or job descriptions?
Yeah. Well, what some organizations will do is they might use something like a competency model. So if there are particular kind of qualities, skills, other characteristics that are important for a particular role, that competency model is then, and we actually have a Sigma competency model. There's 50 competencies and they're split into kind of four category buckets. And being able to articulate what performance actually looks like on those competencies is very important, right? So that gets at the performance review component, having actual behavioral anchors to score people's performance, and also similarly making sure that the job descriptions that you might be writing are aligned with those competencies that you might be looking for, right? So for kind of a useful framework to start thinking about standardization, I would encourage you to check out Sigma's competency framework.
Thanks, Leo. And I will drop a link both to that in the chat as well as a couple more templates that you won't find in the succession planning template library because they fall under what we call foundations. So there's the framework. And then we have a template for creating competency-based job descriptions, as well as competency-based success profiles. The success profiles is in the succession planning process. But I'll just share both of these for you here so that you can take a look. And success profiles. And then you can mix and match from those competencies that Leo mentioned in the 50 competency framework to fill that out. That'll give you a really robust and comprehensive foundation for talent development.
Yeah.
Okay, let me scroll up again here. Okay, zooming in on the difference between the individual and the role, can you give a little bit more information about how to separate critical roles from those critical people and making sure that we're being focused on the critical role?
Yeah. Well, in that case, what does the job description at present, you might think, what does the job description look like right now, right? You can consider too, what makes this person particularly special. Like, let's say you have a job description, this person got hired, but over time, their role has evolved past the job description. So they've taken on a whole bunch of other responsibility, and this person is just extremely critical. That's where you might need to revisit the role itself. Like, what do we need this position to be? And think about, if this person's doing a whole bunch of extra stuff, do we need to now separate this role? Do we need to kind of maybe restructure the job description a little bit? Um, so yeah, it's a tough process, but kind of going back to the foundational documentation you have, and then really thinking about, okay, what is it about what is this person maybe doing over and above the formal role description, and trying to figure out what that delta actually is.
Thanks, Leo. I'll also drop a link to our blog on identifying critical roles. I think it might have a bit more detail on things to consider
Hmm.
about what makes a role critical. So that might help you in paring down what can
Hmm.
be tied to the role rather than the person.
Yeah, just
Um,
as an aside, Helen mentioned AI related stuff at the start of our conversation today. We do have a kind of free tool on the competency page. It's linked on the competency page that people can use. So if you have a job description or you have vocabulary that you use to describe a role, but you want to put it into concrete competency related terms, you can just paste it into that tool and kind of have a discussion um, about about how you might be able to tie that to quantifiable um, competencies within Sigma's framework.
yes, that is the leadership skills assistant. I'll post the link to that as well. That was actually built by our very own Leo right here. It's a lot of fun. I've played around with it, and if you work with humans, then there's something useful for you in there. So definitely take a look at that if you've got 5 minutes. Um, and I dug up the Succession Advisory Team blog. So there's that as well.
Thank you,
Okay.
Helen, for finding all these resources in a very rapid fire fashion.
You're welcome. That's what I'm here for. Okay. What are the main KPIs at a strategic level that would enable us to
Mhm.
track our succession planning process?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's lots, and we typically recommend different ones depending on people's circumstances. But some very easy ones that come to mind, time to fill positions. How long does it actually take you to fill a vacant role? And that hopefully that timeline should shrink over time. That's kind of a broader metric than maybe within particular kind of units. You might be tracking how frequently are people engaging in their development plans, right? How much time are they spending? Um, Maybe looking at metrics like, standard metrics like turnover, employee engagement. Um, there's a wide variety to pick from, just depending on your strategic priorities for the succession plan. So we can definitely kind of analyze that situation and think about what are the high level metrics we can look at, and then kind of go a little bit deeper and start looking at the more person or unit specific metrics that can be tracked over time.
Thank you. Okay, is the Sigma competency model differentiated by level of responsibility? Great question on the framework.
That's a very good question. Not really explicitly differentiated by seniority or level within the organizations. These we do call them all leadership competencies, but they are applicable across a very wide variety of roles to varying extents, right? Um, so no, it's not in and of itself delineated by seniority. However, we do group the categories in a way that can be very helpful. And the leadership skills assistant, after an interaction with it, gives you a little graph or distribution chart of, okay, how many senior leadership skills were identified for you? How many interpersonal leadership skills? How many personal leadership qualities? And I'm missing one. I think I already talked about interpersonal, personal, senior, and the last one presently escapes me, but you get the point. So yes and no. Just because a person is maybe more junior doesn't mean a more kind of senior competency won't appear on their profile, but someone who is more senior might have more of those senior competencies, if that makes sense.
That's great. Thank you, Leo. How do teams that do succession planning well measure competence?
So I guess it really depends on what competence and what. Um, are you measuring competence of potential people who are going to be kind of as part of the succession plan on the succession bench? So I think it really depends on who you're referring to in terms of competence and what you mean by that. Um, but there are ways to measure competence in general. So it just depends where you're applying it.
If it's competence in the sense of a model, then often you can find an assessment corresponding to it. Sigma, for example,
Mhm.
has the leadership skills profile. That is a pretty quick 20-minute assessment that lets you measure your candidates or incoming talent. There's a selection version for hiring on those 50 competencies in the leadership competency framework. So if objective measurement is something that you're interested in, that would be a really good
Mhm.
place to
Yeah.
start.
Yeah, and we can help you build a customized kind of look at what competencies are most important for you, and then think about ways to, well, A, you can use assessments to measure how likely people are to perform well at those competencies, and then also more traditional, structured interview practices, performance appraisal systems that are, structured and behaviorally based so that you can actually use them as part of your core talent strategy.
Perfect. Thank you, Leo. Okay. I see one question here. Do we have the ability to provide information in Spanish? I'll just answer that quickly and say that some of our assessments are available in Spanish. I think we have a very few that have been translated, but overall, we don't have an ongoing translation system available at the moment. If there's a particular resource that you would like translated, please don't hesitate to just fill out the contact form on our website and let us know what that is, and we can take a look at whether that might be feasible for us to provide. Um, and then a comment from Miriam. Thank you very much for the positive feedback. I think we have gotten through everyone's questions, which is great because I just need to ask one question to wrap things up. For those of you who are here to get professional certification credits, please fill out this poll and let me know whether you're here for SHRM or ATD or both, particularly for SHRM because I'll need to send you a certificate of completion and an activity code so that you can get your credits. So I'll just pop that poll over in the corner and you can let me know if that pertains to you. And then the last thing I'll say is that if you enjoyed this webinar, we do have webinars running pretty much monthly over the course of the year. There's a wide range, including other succession-specific topics, talent development ones. I'll drop the link for the webinars in the chat for you as well. And if there's anything else on your mind or questions that come up as you're reviewing the slides or the recording, again, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Our consultants are always happy to chat. And we hope that you found the session practical and that you see some impact on your teams as you apply some of these tools and templates. Oh, yes, and we do take your feedback very seriously, and we make changes to these slides and how we go about our webinars every session. So if you have a moment to fill out the feedback form as well, that would be excellent. And I don't have my phone handy. I don't know if you do. So I will drop a link to that in the chat as well. Hopefully you can sort through all of those. If there's any links that disappear after we close the webinar and you're thinking, oh, what was that blog or template, just send us an email. We'd be happy to send you those documents again. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Leo, for your excellent presentation. We hope you all have a lovely afternoon.
Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate your time. Hope you have an excellent rest of your week.